Today's daf we're going to be learning is Zevachim daf Dalet. Today's daf is sponsored by Sarah Borelowitz in honor of her new granddaughter Rotem Kayla, daughter of Yoel and Daniela Sturman. Mazal tov. Okay, we're going to get started with today's daf. We're back to the issue of Lishma that was talked about in the Mishna, which, by the way, there's some shiurim about it. Alana Stein-Haynes' shiur is up specifically about intent and the more kind of delving into this Lishma, lo Lishma issue. Also, Gefet hopefully will be up in English. It's already up in Hebrew, Rabbi Chana Dreyfus, and in English we'll have Shalavit Schwartz. Hopefully soon that will come. We haven't gotten the material yet, but I'm sure it will come soon. So that's also on this topic of Lishma. It's a very interesting topic, and obviously you're delving into about the issue of how your thought can mess up a korban. If you remember, just to review, now this is called the general category. Today we're going to talk about two categories that disqualify a korban by your intent. One is Shinoi Kodesh, that's the one talked about in the Mishnah, which is you switch the Kodesh from one to the other, right? Instead of intending to do a Shlamim, you do it as an Olah, okay? During the Mishnah talked specifically about Shechita. Today we're going to talk about how we know that this is true in all four Avodot, okay? When we talk about four Avodot, there's a few different four Avodot, but generally we're going to be talking about the four sacrificial rites that are basically leading up to sprinkling the blood on the altar, which is slaughtering the animal, collecting the blood, walking the blood to the altar, and sprinkling the blood on the altar. Now, the first three are just what we call a machshir. It's just enabling. They're enablers because it's not really important in and of itself. It's only because it enables the blood to be sprinkled, which is the highlight of the korban. It's hard for us to understand that really, but the main thing of the korban is sprinkling the blood on the altar, right? You think it's like burning the parts on the altar. That's not a critical part of it. Okay, like whatever gets burnt on the altar. The main part is because the atonement happens with the sprinkling of the blood. So the Mishnah talked about slaughtering an animal for the intent of the wrong korban, right? It was originally designated as one thing and you did it for something else. And we said it's kasher. It actually is fine, meaning it can be continued to be sacrificed, but it doesn't fulfill the obligation of the owner because you've messed that up. Except for a few that it's completely disqualified, like the Chatat and the Pesach, or according to the other different opinions of the Mishnah. What we want to do today, and almost exclusively today until the very last question and answer, which is really the end of the daf, we're basically going to try to find a source, number one, for the fact that this basically messes up the korban. I don't say, right, it doesn't completely ruin it, but it messes up the korban if you switch which one you're doing it for, which is called Shinoi Kodesh. You're switching the kedusha, the sanctity of this korban. How do we know that it's a problem? Number one, for shechita, which is what the Mishnah talked about. Also for zrika, or for kabbalah, holacha, and zrika, for all four. Okay, we're going to go one by one. That's the first part. The second part of what we're going to do today is say, how do we know that another disqualification, if you do shinoi balim, you say instead of sacrificing it for the sake of the person who it's supposed to be, there's intent for a different person. That's also a disqualification. Okay? So those two are both disqualified, right? They're both, again, doesn't completely knock out the korban except for some unique circumstances, but it does mean that this isn't going to fulfill the person's obligation. So we're then going to find a source, look for a source for shechita, zrika, holacha, and kabbalah for that one as well. So let's start our daf. There's a study guide today. Okay, again, I'm going to remind everyone what I said yesterday, which is when you're looking for the study guide, if you use a podcast, it's in the details of the podcast app. You can link to it right from there. And if you're using I think on Spotify, though, it doesn't show up. I don't know why. But on all the other podcast apps, there's a link right there for it at the top of the summary. If you're in our website, it has a new location, which is right at the top where it says Zevachim 4. It also has a link to both the intro of the Masechet and the study guide. Okay, and if you haven't listened to the intro yet, definitely worth listening to. It'll give the perspective that we don't have time to go through in the daf shir. Okay. So how do you know that you need zvicha lishma? Zvicha, I'll remind you, usually when they use the term zvicha, what they mean is sacrificing. Okay, certainly that's what they mean here. How do you know that sacrificing has to be the shema? And like I said, we're going to go through sacrificing, collecting the blood, walking the blood, sprinkling the blood. Okay, we're going to go for each one of those. And that's what the first chart on the sheet is. Okay, I'll just show you for a quick minute right now. I'm not going to share the study guide the whole class, but I will show you right now. Okay. So here we have, right, we're going to basically show the source for this in the Torah. I'm going to go through Shechita, Kabbalah, Zrika, and Holacha in that order. See, each one has a pasuk. And then each time we're going to say, oh, why couldn't we learn from here to all the others? And because each one has a chumrah. And we're going to have this one has a chumrah, this one has a chumrah, this one has a chumrah. Also, we're going to say, well, the chumras also, there could be like Shechita and Kabbalah. We can't learn from there to Zrika because the two of them have a chumrah. And then we're going to have Shechita, Kabbalah, and Zrika together. All three have a certain chumrah about it that's not in Holacha. So we're going to do a bunch of permutations of these things. Okay? Let's go. De'amar kra, starting with Shechita. Im zevach shlamim korbano, if the korban, okay, now, here it says, im zevach shlamim korbano, if your korban is a korban of shlamim. Now, if you notice, you could have just said, im shlamim korbano. If your korban is shlamim, that's a peace offering. If your korban is shlamim, why does it say zevach? That's going to be an extra word here. So that's where we're going to learn our halacha from. Shetehei zvicha l'shem shlamim. The zvicha, which we said, right, zevach could be a korban, but zevach could also be the verb to slaughter. So if, right, what they're saying here, im zevach shlamim korbano, the fact that zevach is next to shlamim and it's an extra word, it teaches you that the zvicha has to be l'shem shlamim. Zevach shlamim, the slaughtering has to be for the sake of shlamim. That teaches us our halacha. The Dilma, now the Gemara suggests, wait a minute, why are you darshaning that? Dilma hainu shmayu. Maybe that's what they call the shlamim. Maybe they call it a zevach shlamim. Maybe that's just part of its name. And that means you can't darshan this. Well, midachtiv hamakriv, what they're basically going to prove is, lots of other times it just says shlamim. And that's why you can't say its name is zevach shlamim. And then the word zevach really is unnecessary, which teaches us our halacha. How do we know? Midachtiv, and they're going to quote two psukim here. Hamakriv et dam hashlamim, hazorek et dam hashlamim. Okay, both those psukim talk about the blood of the shlamim. It doesn't say dam zevach hashlamim. It just says the shlamim. From there, right, the lo ktiv zevach, and it doesn't say zevach. V'hacha ktiv zevach, and here it does say zevach. Shma minash tez vicha l'shem shlamim. Okay, and that proves it. Must be, the slaughtering has to be for the sake of shlamim. So we've got 1 out of 4 right now, or 1 out of 8, because we're going to basically do this for Shita Kodesh and Shinoi Balim. So we've got one part done. Eshkachan, now the Gemara is going to keep doing this. Eshkachan zvicha. Okay, so you've proven me 1, zvicha. Shar avodot minalan. How do we get the other 3? And now we're going to go one by one, the other 3 avodot. V'chitem, and now again, what makes these 4 avodot unique? They are the 4 rituals, or rites, you want to call them, that have to be done in the temple. Okay, if you skip one of them, it's no good. Other than holacha, which is a bit of a machloket about, okay? Well, we'll talk about that soon. We won't actually see the machloket, but we'll see what the basis of the machloket is. So now the obvious would be, well, it says it by shechita. Why don't we just learn all the main 4 avodot? Just like shechita is one of the main 4 avodot, we'll learn from there to the rest. Well, we can't do that. We're going to see the word v'chitema a lot today, okay? V'chitema is always introducing an answer that will be rejected, because it's going to say v'chitema, and when you say this, we have a response to it. So if you're going to say, we'll just learn from shechita to all the other 3, but there's a chumrah by shechita that isn't by anything else. What is that? Malas v'cha shekein nifsala shelo l'shem ochlim b'pesach. There's a special halacha by Pesach, you might remember this, when we learned about Korban Pesach. When it's slaughtered, okay, everyone has to register for the Korban Pesach. And it's slaughtered specifically for anyone who was registered, not for anyone who wasn't registered. But not only that, all the registered people have to eat a kezayit of the meat. So now, what happens if you slaughter it for the sake of all the people registered, and within those people registered, there's people who can't eat a kezayit of meat. Okay, not because they're vegetarian, right? But because they're sick or too old to eat meat, right? Maybe they don't have teeth or something, right? They can't eat the meat. So if there's somebody, or they're, physically ill and can't, can only put liquids in their body or something. So if you do it for somebody, so you slaughter it for someone who can't eat the meat, it's disqualified. The whole korban is disqualified. But if you sprinkle the blood for the sake of someone who can't eat the meat, it's not. It's only the slaughtering, not any of the other avodot. So that means there's a chumrah by shchita that isn't in everything else. So if you're going to have a pasuk then that proves this other thing that's in shchita, we can't just say, oh, let's learn from there to everything else, because this we don't learn to everything else. So maybe that we don't learn, right? This has a stringency in shchita that doesn't exist anywhere else. So maybe this issue of lishma is only for slaughtering and not for anything else. Okay, so we need a pasuk. Ela amar kra. So now we're looking for, right? We're going to talk about Kabbalah first. Hamakriv et dam hashlamim. Okay, the word makriv we're going to see throughout the Masechet could mean a lot of different things. When you see the word makriv, you probably think of sacrifice, right? You would translate that as sacrifice from korban. But ikriv also means to bring closer, right? So the simple reading of makriv in the Torah is actually to walk it to the altar, because it's to bring the blood closer to where it needs to get to. But often it's darshaned in a different way. And also, by the way, makriv, because it's the sacrifice, what's the most important part of the sacrifice? The sprinkling of the blood. So another obvious interpretation is to say it's the sprinkling of the blood. Okay, there's one famous pasuk where they say it can't be the sprinkling of the blood because it starts with hikriv, it goes to zorek. Okay, we're going to see part of that pasuk later. It says here, v'shachat ben abakar in vayikra aleph hey. He slaughters the ben abakar lifnei Hashem. V'krivu b'nei Aaron kohanim et adam. Okay, they're hikrivu et adam. We don't know what that means. V'zarku et adam, and then they sprinkle the blood. So they say, well, we would have thought hikrivu is sprinkle, but it can't be because it said sprinkle the blood right after. So it must be hikrivu is Kabbalah. Okay, so that pasuk they learned hikriv is Kabbalah, and now we're going to take this pasuk and learn the halacha. So once we prove from there makriv is Kabbalah, we're going to say makriv in this pasuk also is Kabbalah. Hamakriv et dam hashlamim. Now, the context of that pasuk is already the shlamim. So what word is unnecessary? Shlamim. It could just say hamakriv et hadam. It doesn't have to say et dam hashlamim. The peace offering blood, we know we're talking about the peace offering there in that pasuk. So that word is unnecessary. What does it teach you? Shetehei Kabbalah l'shem shlamim. Again, just like we said, Zevach shlamim is coming to teach you. The shchita has to be for the sake of the shlamim. This pasuk is teaching you the accepting of the blood, collecting it in that sanctified vessel, right, which then sanctifies the blood, right, catching it basically after the shchita. That has to be l'shem shlamim. Okay, so now we have slaughtering and we have collecting. Now, lichta rachmana b'Kabbalah v'leilav shchita mina. So why doesn't? Okay, I see your question, Tina. They're gonna darshan that later. So patience. Lichta rachmana b'Kabbalah v'leilav shchita mina. Now, why didn't the Torah just say this about Kabbalah? And then we would have learned shchita from there. Okay, we couldn't learn from shchita because shchita has a chumrah, but they didn't need a special pasuk by shchita. They could have just had Kabbalah, and then once we have Kabbalah, we say, oh, it's true for shchita as well, and perhaps even all the other avodot. But mishum d'ikal mifrach, again, everything's going to have a chumrah, as I showed you in the chart. Ikal mifrach, you can knock that out and say mala Kabbalah shakem psula bezal v'isha. So a woman can't do Kabbalah, and a non-Kohen can't do Kabbalah. It has to be a male Kohen who does the Kabbalah. Shchita, now all the other avodot it's true for also, okay, Kabbalah. From Kabbalah on, everything has to be done by a male Kohen. But shchita, by the way, interesting, can be done by a non-Kohen and can be done by a woman. A woman's allowed to slaughter the korbanot in the Bein HaMikdash. So, that is a unique chumrah, Kabbalah over shchita. So, if Kabbalah is more severe in that way, maybe the lishma issue is only for Kabbalah, and that's why you need a separate pasuk for shchita and a separate pasuk for Kabbalah. Okay. Eshkacham, the Gemara is going to remind us what we've done so far. We got shchita and Kabbalah. What's left? Zrika. Okay, we also have to get to holacha, but right now they're on zrika. Zrika minal. V'chitema, we're back to a v'chitema, an answer they're going to reject. If you're going to say leilaf mehane, the obvious would be let's learn it from shchita and Kabbalah together. But malahane, right? And each one has a chumrah, but each one doesn't have the chumrah of the other, so you could theoretically learn from the combination of the two. But the two of them have two chumrah, which are actually a little difficult to say these are really chumrah, but we'll have to accept what they say. These are two chumrot that exist by shchita and Kabbalah both, and not in zrika. What are they? Malahane shekain te'unot tzafon v'yeshna b'chata'ot ha'pnimiyot. They have to be done on the northern side of the azara. Okay, this is only, by the way, in kodshei kodshim. Kodshim kalim can be done slaughtered anywhere in the azara, but if they're kodesh kodeshim, the higher level sanctity, they have to be slaughtered in the northern part. Whereas the zrika, now this is the complicated part. It's not like the zrika you could do anywhere. It has to be done on the altar, which is in one location. It's not like, right? So, not clear why tzafon specifically is a chumrah that doesn't exist by zrika, when zrika has its own unique location. And the same thing is going to be for the second chumrah, which is in the chataot pnimiyot. Okay, you might not remember that term, but the par halim davar shel tzibur, the par kohen HaMashiach that we just learned about in Horayot, those had unique halachot. They were not, the blood of those korbanot is not, okay, they have a bunch of unique halachot. They're called the chataot pnimiyot, the sin offerings that are the inner sin offerings opposed to outer. Why inner than outer? There's two altars in the temple. One is in the inner sanctuary. That's usually just used for the incense burning. And one is in the outer, in the Azara area, right near where they do the slaughtering. And that's where the most of the sacrifices, the blood is sprinkled. But the chataot pnimiyot, they're called pnimiyot because they go in the inner altar. So what they're trying to say here is, shchita and Kabbalah happen just the same way, even in the chataot pnimiyot. Whereas the zrika doesn't happen in the chataot pnimiyot. Now it does happen. It happens in the inner sanctuary, but it doesn't happen on the outer altar in the chataot pnimiyot. So that means that zrika, right, that shchita and Kabbalah, because they happen throughout all the korbanot, and zrika, now again, it's tricky because zrika does happen in all the korbanot, but it happens in a different manner in the chataot pnimiyot, like it's not done in the regular way. So that creates a stringency that exists by those two that doesn't happen in zrika, which is they're done in their same way for all the sacrifices, even for the inner ones. Not exactly the strongest chumrah, but okay. So there's two things that are unique to those two, not for zrika. So you can even say they're unique, okay, as opposed to more stringent. But therefore you can't learn from there to there. Okay, Ela Amar Kra, you have a pasuk for zrika now. Hazorek edam hashlamim. So again, it's the same thing as the previous. Your zorek, the blood, could have just said the blood. Why does it say the blood of the shlamim? To teach you, shetei zrika l'shem shlamim, that the zrika has to be in the name of the shlamim. Right, and not, let's say, for an ola, which would mess up the korban. V'lichta rachman b'zrika, v'leilaf mina. Okay, so now they say, well, if we got zrika, and we said, right, and the other two are more severe, then why don't we just say, all we need is a pasuk by zrika, and we'll learn to shchita and Kabbalah from zrika, from the sprinkling of the blood. V'leilaf mina, and we'll learn from there. But mishum dika lemifrach, here we keep going with our stringencies. There's a stringency by zrika that doesn't exist by all the others. Mal zrika sheken chayav aleha zar mita. Now a zar can't do the Kabbalah or the holacha either. They can do the shchita, they can't do the Kabbalah and the holacha. But a zar meaning a non-kohen. But if a non-kohen does zrika, he gets death penalty. Okay? Not by the court, by God, okay, but death by the hands of God. If a zar does Kabbalah and holacha, doesn't get punished by death. So therefore, that's obviously a stringency by zrika that doesn't exist in the other ones. Right? It's not even a problem at all in shchita, and in Kabbalah you're not going to get death. Okay, fine. So now we have a pasuk by all three, and we understand why we need a pasuk by all three. Now we're going to move to holacha. Eshkachan, and here's your answer to your question, Tina. Why didn't they say la kriv is holacha? Eshkachan kulu holacha minalan. So now we have all the rest. What about bringing the blood? V'chitem aleilaf mikulu. So first they're going to say again, why don't we just say, right? If you're going to say, we learn from all of them, malakulu shekain avodah she'i afshar levatla. Now, all other three must happen. But tomar baholacha, now this I mentioned earlier, she'efshar levatla, you theoretically could do without holacha. How so? You have to get the blood to the altar. How are you going to do that if you don't walk it over? Well, you could actually just slaughter the animal right next to the altar. And then you'll be there already. And then you won't even need to walk it to the altar. So you don't really need holacha. Okay, we're going to see a machloket later in the Mishna where Rabbi Shimon says it's not actually one of the four avodot because there's only three avodot because we could do without it. Okay, Tanakama still thinks it's one of the four main avodot, but the point is it theoretically doesn't have to happen, and therefore maybe you could learn it from right. Maybe you would say since it's not so critical, it doesn't need to be lishma. When you do the holacha, if you have in mind for the wrong korban, maybe it won't mess it up. Okay, but we do know it does mess it up. So where do we get it from? Not from the others, but from a pasuk. Ela amar kra vihi kriva tekol mizbecha. This is talking about the burning the parts on the altar. You bring all the pieces of meat to the altar. Okay, so someone explains that's talking about bringing the parts of the animal's body to the ramp. Vitanya v'hikrivu. Okay, there's a different. Right, this is two different psukim. And then there's another pasuk which I read you before, which is 7 psukim earlier. V'shachatet ben abakar v'ikrivu b'nei Aaron HaKohen, and that's b'nei Aaron HaKohanim, and that's what I said that where they say, don't think it's right. It's not zrika because I always say zrika. It's not holacha because what do they say? Zo kabbalat adam. Now, we don't know why. So Tita, you asked why don't they assume it's holacha? We don't know why, but they assume Krivu was talking about accepting the blood. V'apik rachmana belashon holacha lemeimer de holacha lo tafka michlal kabbalah. Now, even though they explained hikrivu, which again literally means to bring close, which sounds like it's talking about to walk it over to the altar, but they say no, it's talking about accepting the blood, probably because accepting the blood is really more important because you're actually sanctifying the blood. But it uses the language that sounds like it's saying walk the blood over to teach you. That's what it means. Lo tafka michlal kabbalah. Okay, in other words, what it teaches you is holacha. Afik rachmana belashon halacha. They put it in the language of walking it over to tell you lemeimra de holacha lo tafka michlal kabbalah, to teach you that holacha is no different than kabbalah. Okay, so while we say it's really talking about Kabbalah, it includes in it Kabbalah and holacha. And that's to teach you that whatever's true for Kabbalah is true for holacha. That's why they use that language. It teaches you 2 things, really. Kabbalah, and it teaches you the holacha is like Kabbalah. So once you have, right, so that would then say that v'hikriv, right, so what we're basically saying now is once you have a pasuk for Kabbalah, you could learn also to holacha because they're one and the same, basically. And they're not one and the same, but they're treated in the same way. Okay, so that's part 1. And that's the first chart on the page, which basically shows you the psukim for each of them. You can quickly look at it and you can scan it and see the 4 psukim because we got sort of often a lot of different tangents in trying to say, why don't we learn this one from that one and that one from that one? You can see all the chumrot of each in the chart and you can see what the psukim for each one was. Eshkachan Shinoi Kodesh. So that took care of the first topic, Shinoi Kodesh. Okay, and the Gemara is again doing a good review for us. That taught us Shinoi Kodesh, that if you do Shelo L'Shem, this korban, but a different korban, it doesn't work. Shinoi Ba'ale Minalan. How do we know that if you think you're doing it for the wrong person, it also ruins the sacrifice? Amar Pinchas Berei Rav Ami, and we're going to do the same type thing, but a little bit different, okay? And if you look at the chart for a minute, I'll share it for a minute. If you look at the chart here, okay, so this chart's pretty clear. Pasuk, 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 right? And this pasuk is really just connecting holacha to Kabbalah and all the chumras of each of them. But Shinoi Ba'ale Minalan, we're going to have a pasuk for Shechita. You can see already here there's going to be some difficulties on this pasuk, but they'll resolve them. Then we're going to try to do Kabbalah, Zrika, and holacha all together. We're going to basically try to say, let's just learn from Shechita to all the others, but that's not going to work. Then I highlighted them in yellow so you see. Then we're going to do one for Zrika. And then we're going to do for Kabbalah and holacha, which already we proved go together, because once you have Kabbalah, you have holacha as well. Okay, and that's basically what we're going to do to cover us almost the whole daf. Okay, then there's just one question answer at the very end. So let's go through. Amar Pinchas Berei Rav Ami Amar Ubisal Zevach Todat Shlamav. Now this is about a korban toda. Korban toda is a Thanksgiving offering that's a type of korban shlamim. Okay. So now it says the meat of the zevach, which again literally means the sacrifice, but it also means to slaughter. Todat shlamav, the toda of the shlamim, meaning the type of shlamim that's a toda offering. What do we learn from this pasuk? Why does it say zevach? It doesn't really need zevach. Shetei zvicha l'shem toda. Now this is just like the previous drasha, right? That the zevach has to be for the sake of a toda, not for some other offering. Now we're looking for Shinoi Ba'alim. That's not Shinoi Ba'alim. That's Shinoi Kodesh. But we're going to do an Ime No Inyan. Ime No Inyan means, well, if you don't need it to teach that, because we already know that, it must be teaching you something else. What must it be teaching? Instead of Shinoi Kodesh, it must be teaching Shinoi Ba'alim. So they're going to say, so I'll read it inside, Ime No Inyan L'Shinoi Kodesh, T'nafgalan Mehatam, because we already learned that at the top of our page, T'nei Inyan L'Shinoi Ba'alim. So we'll assume it's talking about Shinoi Ba'alim. So now they say, wait a minute. How can you darshan the same way we did this before? How can you darshan that from the pasuk? Don't we darshan something else from that pasuk? Okay, so now they're going to say, right? Last time actually we did it. We had a different kind of question, but this is a question Eshkachan Shino Kodesh Shino Balin Minala. Okay. V'hai lahachi hu da'ata. Wait a minute. It's coming to teach that? No. We need that pasuk for something else. We know we have rules. You can't learn both. Ubesal zevach todat shlamav. Okay, that's the same pasuk, and now we're going to darshan something else entirely. Abba Chanino Mishum Rabbi Eliezer Bala Lamed Todah Sheshachata L'Shem Shlamim Kshira Shlamim Sheshachatan L'Shem Todah Psula. This, the Zevach Shlam, okay, the Basal Zevach Todat Shlamav is coming to teach you, right? It says Todah of the Shlamim. What's it coming to tell you? Well, if you slaughter the Todah for the sake of a Shlamim, it works. Why? Because the Todah is a type of Shlamim. But if you slaughter a regular Shlamim offer for the sake of a Todah, it doesn't work. Okay? Why? My fresh brain said, why is there a difference? This is like when you learn in math about sets, right? So this is just a set. Todah kriya shlamim. Todah is part of the set of shlamim. It's a type of shlamim offering. So if you're doing the Todah and you say shlamim, that's the same thing. But, right, obviously Todah is more specific, but it's generally, it includes the shlamim. The ain't shlamim kriya Todah, but a regular shlamim offering is not necessarily a Thanksgiving offering. So if you're bringing a regular shlamim, it's not at all, right? If you're bringing a regular shlamim offering, it's not a Todah. So if you do it for the sake of a Todah, it's not valid. And that's what we learn from it. To which they say, okay, fine. We can learn both. Why? Anan mi zevach kamrinan, because we were talking about zevach. In other words, we were learning our drasha from the word zevach, slaughtering. You're learning it from todat shlamav. So that's okay. I have this word, you have that word, we're good. But wait, there's another drasha they learn from this pasuk, and that's going to make it even more problematic. Now, the pasuk is talking about really, I didn't read you the rest of the pasuk, but what it's telling you is a korban shlamim, usually you can eat on the day you bring the sacrifice, the next night, and the next day. And then it becomes notar, leftover. That's a big topic we're going to talk about a lot in this Masechet. This pasuk is telling you that the korban todah has to be eaten, not like a regular shlamim, but it says, b'yom korbano ye'achel, on the day you bring the sacrifice, which is that day and the night, but by the next morning, lo yaniach mimenu ad boker. You can't leave anything over till the morning. So the drasha goes like this: chatat va'asham minayin. Now that rule for the todah is also true for chatat va'asham. How do we know that? From our pasuk. Why? Now I told you this word zevach is going to mean different things. The word zevach could also just mean general sacrifice. So what are they going to say? Talmud lamar zevach. Okay, zevach includes also the todah and the shlam. So now in kain nichtov kra. So again, how can we learn that? Really learns it from zevach, and our whole drasha was from zevach. So how are we going to learn it? In kain nichtov kra ubesal todat shlamav zevach. If it really wanted to say that it's also true for todah, for chatat and asham, and just that, it would have put zevach at the end of that phrase, because it would have said the basar of the todat shlamav zevach, and they'll say, oh yeah, there's other things just like it. My zevach. Why did it put the zevach earlier? Shema min atarite. We can darshan two things. Number one, from the fact that the word is there. Number two, from the fact that the word is specifically in the placement that it is. That can teach you two things. So that's how, in the end, we could use that drasha. Okay, so check one. We've got now 1/4. We have, right, or 1/8 of the whole, right? Again, we're up to 5/8. We've got the first 4 in the first section. Now we have the first one of the 4 in the second section. Eshkachan zvicha. So we've gotten zvicha, which again was learned. I'm just going to remind you from Ime no Inyan. Right? It was this pasuk, which really seems to be saying it has to be done for the sake of a shlamim. But since it can't be teaching you that because we already have a pasuk, so we're saying it teaches you about messing up on the owner. So v'chitem aleilaf so sharva don't mean alam. V'chitem aleilaf mizvicha. If you want to say again the chitema, you want to say learn it from slaughtering. Just like we said before, there's a unique chumrah by shchita that that it won't work. It's the only one that won't work if you think about it for people who can't eat the korban pesach. So it's got a unique chumrah. Maybe the shinoi balim is only by that. So ne'emra zvicha b'shinoi kodesh v'ne'emra zvicha b'shinoi balim. Ma zvicha ne'emra b'shinoi kodesh lo chilakta ben zvicha l'shar vodot. So now we come up with the second answer, which is, if you now compare, first section of today's daf, we had slaughtering, and then we were able to learn all the other 4 as well. So now we're going to say the following. If slaughtering is forbidden for Shinoi Kodesh, and slaughtering is forbidden with Shinoi Baalim, then, and in Shinoi Kodesh, it applies also to all the other 4 avodot. Then why don't we just learn once we say shinoi baalim is disqualified with slaughtering, we could just say, well, just like in the previous section, it actually applies to all 4 avodot. This will also apply to all 4 avodot. So as we need one pasuk to prove that there's an issue of shinoi baalim, which we had, specifically by slaughtering. That's not so important. Once it's by slaughtering, and also the other one's by slaughtering, but it's also in the other 4 avodot. Let's just kind of copy and paste and say, same thing's true for here. Well, ikal mifrach. We're back to our, doesn't work because there's a chumrah. Now we have to prove what? Chumrah by shinoi baalim, that doesn't, by shinoi kodesh, lishma lo lishma, right? Changing it to the wrong owner. Okay? Because shinoi kodesh has 4 stringencies, or 4 unique halachot that don't exist by changing the owner. What are they? Psula begufa, okay, shekem psula begufa, ma l'shinoi kodesh, sorry, you can knock it out by saying, ma l'shinoi kodesh, saying I'm doing it for the sake of the wrong korban, is more severe because that's a psul begufa, that's a psul in the korban itself. Okay, usually a psul in the korban itself is a mum, like the animal is messed up. It's not exactly a psul here. Later the Gemara is going to question this one a little, okay? Whereas the psul of shinoi baalim is not really in the korban, it's really in the owner. That's, I guess, the easy way to explain this, even though the Gemara is going to kind of reject this soon. Yeshna ba'arba avodot. It exists by all 4 avodot, whereas shinoi baalim doesn't. Okay, that makes no sense. Aren't we finding a source for the 4 avodot right now? Okay, so what this means is something different. Until now, we said if you have a thought while you're doing any of the 4 avodot, of either shinoi kodesh, either shinoi baalim, it's disqualified, and that's what we're looking for sources for. But, right, again, shinoi baalim means I'm doing it for the sake of the wrong person. Now we're going to learn that shinoi baalim, your intent has to be specifically about the sprinkling of the blood. Meaning, when it comes to shinoi kodesh, I can be slaughtering, and I'm saying I'm slaughtering for the sake of the wrong korban, I can mess it up. But while I'm doing shinoi baalim, okay, again, I'm not supposed to be, but if I did, let's say I'm slaughtering, and I think I'm slaughtering this for somebody else. It's actually not a problem. I have to, while I'm slaughtering, be thinking about I'm going to sprinkle the blood for the wrong person. Because the person is really important when it comes to the atonement part, which is the sprinkling of the blood. So it's true that I can disqualify it in any of the 4 avodot, but only if my machshava, my thought, or my speech, depending on the machloket we saw, is specifically about I'm doing it for the sake, right, to sprinkle the blood for the wrong person. So while I'm catching the blood, I think, I'm catching the blood so that I can sprinkle it for the wrong person. That's the only case we'll be disqualified. So that's, again, unique halacha. For the lishma, it could be even I'm slaughtering it for the wrong person. I'm catching the blood for the wrong korban. Catching the blood for the wrong korban. Yeshno la'achar mita, it will, if it's disqualified, if it's designated as korban, then the owner dies, and then the heirs bring the korban in their place, and then they do shinoi baalim or shinoi kodesh. Shinoi baalim is actually irrelevant because the baalim are dead. Okay, but shinoi kodesh would still be irrelevant disqualification. V'yeshno b'tzibor kibiyachid. Okay, the shinoi kodesh doesn't matter whether it's korban tzibor or korban individual korban or a communal korban. But obviously there's no shinoi baalim for a public korban because the public korban belongs to everyone. So there is no such thing as I'm doing it for the wrong person. It's all for everybody. Okay, so 4 reasons why, right? 4 unique stringencies why we can't learn from shinoi kodesh to shinoi baalim. That just like, right, that's in shchita and that's in all of them. This one's in shchita, it should be in all of them as well. Can't do that. Now, before we go on to try to find the proof, we're now at the top of Amud Bet. Avagav de tarte lav dafka, tarte mia dafka. Even though out of those 4, 2 are not necessarily true, or not necessarily convincingly true, 2 still are. Okay, now we're going to say 2 we can kind of possibly take off the list. Okay, but it doesn't really matter because then we're still left with 2 stringencies. Right? As long as we have 1 stringency, we can't learn from one to the other. So now here we'll go back to the 2. Mishna shinoi baalim de lo have psulo begufo. Now, why did we say it's not a psul in the guf for shinoi baalim? If I change the owner, right, that's not ruining the korban itself. Why not? Well, it's because again, what is usually a psul begufo? A mum, a blemish, like a physical change in the animal, where the animal becomes blemished. Here, it's just machshava ba'alma. It's just in your thoughts. Okay, or according to Rashi, in your words, right? Thoughts mean you express your thoughts. Shinoi kodesh, nami machshava ba'almahu, but shinoi kodesh is the same thing. So it could be neither is really psul begufo, because psul begufo really would be something physical, and this is all just what you're thinking. Ella kevan de achshave pasla, chanami kevan de achshava pasla. Okay, so basically both of them are a disqualification of machshava. They're both the same, and maybe neither of them is psul b'gufo. So we can take that one off the list. And the other one that's going to come off the list is only according to one opinion. He says, even shinoi balim will disqualify it after death. And as if the heir is bringing the korban in place of the heir's father, for example, or mother. So if then, when the korban is actually brought, there's a shinoi balim, since the heir is coming in place, there could be shinoi balim that could disqualify it. So he thinks that one's also. But still, we still have two, so we're fine. No, it's not fine. That means we can't learn from Shino Kodesh to all the others, right, to the Shino Balim. So we're still left with, all we have right now in Shino Balim is Shchita. How do we know that it's disqualified, right, that it messes up the Korban for all the other Avodot? So now we're going to go to Zrika. And that's where I highlighted in yellow on the sheet. Because before we tried to learn all three in one lump sum. That's why the chart was a little hard to chart out. First chart was easier because I could do Shchita, Zrika, Kabbalah, right? Each one separate. Here they kind of clumped them all together for the whole first section. Now we're going to separate them out, and that's why I highlighted in yellow, so now you know we're doing Zrika. Rav Ashi, El Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi says, Amar Kra, the Pasuk says, by Zrika, V'nirtzalo, this will appease, right, this is an appeasement for him, L'chaper alav, to atone for him, and that's the Zrika, that's what does the atonement. Now, it says alav v'lo chavero. It has to be for you, and not, right, for him, the person who the sacrifice is for, and not for anyone else. And that teaches you the psul. To which the Gemara says, again, we keep doing this kind of line of questioning. There's a different drasha in the pasuk. We can't darshan this because there's some other drasha. What is that? Well, v'nirtzalo l'chaper alav, again, a totally different halacha. Rabbi Shimon Omer, the word alav is teaching you, on him, et she'alav chayav b'achriyuto. Et she'eno alav, eno chayav b'achriyuto. This is a totally different halacha. Difference between a neder and a nidava. Okay? A neder is they're both voluntary offerings, but they're both two different types. A neder is when someone says, Harei alai. I take upon myself, I vow, I'm going to bring a korban. A nidava is, I say, this animal is going to be brought as a korban. What's the difference? If it's alav, then I've accepted responsibility. So if something happens to the animal I designated, I have to bring a different animal in its stead because I committed to bring a sacrifice. If I say this animal will be a sacrifice, and then the animal dies or runs away, I'm not obligated because the obligation was on the animal, not on me. So that means eno chayav b'achriyut. I don't have to take responsibility. So what does he say? The word alav comes to say only if it's alav do you have responsibility and have to bring a different animal instead, but not if it's not alav. V'amar Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi, just explaining this braita. Rav Yitzchak bar Avdimi says, "My taima kevan amar alai keman de'taon le'akatve." Since you said on me, it's like it's hanging on your shoulder. In other words, you're responsible to do it. Right, keman de'taon le'akatve dami. He's like someone who's got something on their shoulder. So what's the answer? If we use that pasuk for something else, what's Rav Ashi going to say? Rav Ashi mi v'nirtza lo lechaper ka'amar. That drasha was on alav. Our drasha, which we thought was on alav, on him, is actually not. It's really from v'nirtza lo. It will be an appeasement for him. Meaning, the lo is the word that we darshan. For him specifically, not if they do it in the name of somebody else. And that's how we get zrika, from the word lo. Okay. Eshkachan zvicha v'zrika, kabbalah minala. Now we're on to the next one. We've got zrika. We've got slaughter, the shchita. Now we're left with Kabbalah and Holacha, because we already proved from the previous that whatever you say for Kabbalah is true for Holacha. So even though it doesn't say Holacha, what they really mean is accepting the blood and bringing the blood to the altar. Now, again, we're going to start with our V'chitema. If you want to say Leilaf Mizvicha, Uzrika, let's learn from the other two. But, now we didn't see this yet, so we didn't try to do this in the previous. But Zmal Izvicha Uzrika, the two of them have a chumrah that you don't have by collecting the blood, which is shekain avodah shechayavin aleh b'chutz. If you do those two outside the temple, you're punished by death. Okay, death by the hands of God. If you do the Kabbalah and the Zrika and the Holacha outside, okay, if you have the blood outside at that point, obviously you have to bring it to the altar. You're inside, but if you do the Kabbalah of the Dam, let's say in the beginning of the Holacha outside the temple, you don't get death. So that means they're more strict, and maybe then the psul of Shino Balim is only by them. El Amar Rav Ashi. So Rav Ashi is going to bring another proof. Atya me'el nazir. Okay, we can learn from the El Nazir. Now, once we're going to do this, we're actually going to have a proof from here. The problem is going to be maybe it's just true for the Nazir and not for anything else, okay? And it's a type of shlamim, so maybe it's only shlamim and not anything else, and that's what we're going to have to do at the end. So let's learn from the El Nazir. It's one of the 3 korbanot the Nazir brings when he finishes being a Nazir. Dichtiv ve'eta'ayel ya'aseh zevach shlamim. Now, they take this word ya'aseh, and what do they learn from this? She'tehei asiyato, the doing of the korban, should be l'shem shlamim. Now, we have to do 2 things here. One is say asiyah means all the 4 avodot that you have to do, which then would include Kabbalah and Holacha. And what's the problem? It has to be l'shem shlamim. That's shinoi kodesh, not shinoi baalim, but obviously we already know shinoi kodesh. So again, we're going to do an imeno inyan. Imeno inyan l'shinoi kodesh, t'nafkale mehatan, because we already learned that. T'nei inyan l'shinoi baalim. So we're going to switch this and say this pasuk is really talking about shinoi baalim. And we're going to say it's talking about all the 4 avodot because of the word asiyah. So again, we're going to have a question. Amrle Rav Acha bar Abba leRava, Ema ya'aseh klal zevach prat. Klal prat ein bechlal amasha beprat. Zvicha im midyachrin lo. Now that pasuk has the word zevach in it, okay? And it has a klal prat because it says et al ya'aseh zevach shlamim. Zevach is slaughtering, right? So ya'aseh is general. It sounds like all the 4 avodot. But then it says zevach, which is slaughtering only. So when you have a klal uprat, what's the rule? It's only the prat, okay? It only relates to the prat, which is slaughtering. So maybe this pasuk is only talking about slaughtering and not about anything else, which is what we're looking for. We're looking for Kabbalah and Holacha. So we're going to have 2 answers to this. One is, Iktiv ya'aseh shlamim zevach kid kamarta. If it had said, ya'aseh shlamim zevach, then we would have had klal prat and you would have been right. But, kid kamarta, like you said. But hashte dichtiv ya'aseh zevach shlamim, what's the problem with that? Well, what are you doing in this? You're doing the shlamim, right? You're doing the zevach shlamim. Now, what you want to say, ya'aseh shlamim is really the general. The zevach is the prat. But now we have a problem because the klal and prat is split in the middle, okay? Because really ya'aseh zevach is the sentence. Ya'aseh shlamim. It will be a shlamim. But, right, because you're trying to say the El Nazir should be brought as a shlamim. But the word zevach comes smack in the middle of that general thing. So they're going to call it like this. Havele klal she'eino maleh. It's not a complete klal because the klal is cut off. And the second word of the klal is put after the prat. You can't have v'chol klal uprat she'eino maleh ein danim oto b'klal uprat. We don't do a klal uprat in that way when the klal is cut in the middle by a word of the prat. It doesn't work that way. Okay? So that's one possibility. We don't even have a klal uprat because it's cut in the middle. Ravina, a different answer is lo olam dani. It is a klal uprat, but it's a klal uprat, but it's a klal uprat to klal. You forgot that the next word is zevach shlamim la Hashem. Now la Hashem means anything you bring to Hashem. That's a klal. So ula Hashem chazar v'kalal. Now klal uprat to klal. What's the rule? Anything that's like the prat is included, and what's like the prat? All the other 3 avodot. So that will work. Amar le Rav Achami difti le Ravina. Now we're going to get back to his klal uprat in a minute and explain it, spell it out. But first we have a little break because someone asked a question. But v'halo dame klal akama leklal batra. But you can't have a klal uprat when the first klal is different from the second klal. These are 2 completely different klals. Why? Klal akama marbe asiyot. Klal akama says anything that's asiyah, which is the 4 avodot, right? Shchita, Kabbalah, Holacha, Zrika. But v'tulo, but nothing more. Klal batra is kol Hashem, anything that's brought to God. Now, what's brought to God besides the 4 avodot? It's really the things that are put on the altar. Now, there's a lot of things put on the altar that are not part of the 4 avodot. So that includes many more things, like filu shfichat shirayim, the extra blood that's left over gets poured on the bottom of the altar, and haktarat imurim, burning the parts on the altar. Those aren't the critical elements, but they are parts that are brought to God. So when the klal of pat, the klal at the beginning is not the same as the klal at the end, you can't learn a klal of prat to klal. So how can you say that there's a klal of prat to klal? To which he answers, Hatani debei Rabbi Yishmael beklali uprate. Rabbi Yishmael actually does learn klal prat in this way. He has no problem. So, okay, even if they're different, you could still do a klal prat. So Ravina has the klal prat to klal. Let's read how it works. Klal prat to klal, iat hadan elikein prat. Everything's like the prat. Ma prat mifurash u'b'inan l'shma, af kol avodah u'b'inan l'shma. Mefurash avodah u'b'inan l'shma, af kol avodah u'b'inan l'shma. What makes this unique? It's one of the 4 avodot, right? Therefore, any of the 4 avodot needs to be lishma. And again, lishma means l'shem the baalim, because it can't mean lishma. We already learned that, because we already know that. Ima prat mefurash avodah v'chayvin ala b'chutz, af kol avodah v'chayvin ala b'chutz. Okay, you can either read this as a question, or it's like also explaining even more, because you're going to see there's a bunch of parts to be built here. They're going to say like this, but wait. The prat is avoda, but it's also an avoda that you're chayiv if you leave the temple for, which we said is not true for some of them, right? So it might be only including things that are similar that you're also chayiving b'chutz, like for example, shchita uzrika in, but kabbalah and holacha would be out because there's no problem. It can't do them outside, but you won't get death for it. And inami, alternatively though, you could say ma prat mefurash davar ta'un safon v'yeshno b'chatot pnimiyot, av kol ta'un safon v'yeshno b'chatot pnimiyot, which would mean what are the 2 that have that? Shchita v'kabbalah in zrika lo. So if you say it has to be like shchita, you could either say it's like shchita and zrika, or it's like shchita and kabbalah, because shchita has certain things that's similar, specifically only to kabbalah and only to zrika. So where does that leave us? Well, because in other words, theoretically you could exclude kabbalah, or you could theoretically exclude zrika, but since it could go that way and could go that way, shkulin him via v'yavo. In the end, it really balances it out. Because it can't be that, because you could do it both ways. So they balance each other out, and that's how everything could be in. Okay? Okay, this is a different language. According to many commentaries, it's really saying the same thing, which is each one in the end kind of stands alone because of this whole back and forth, that each one kind of knocks the other one out. Or a third possibility, ibait ema zrika midarav ashi nafka. Maybe really it is learning only shchita and kabbalah, which have the chataot pnimiyot and that the blood, right, they're done the same way, whereas the blood is done differently in the chataot pnimiyot, and they need safon, and it's excluding zrika, and zrika we have the other pasuk for, because remember, we were just trying to find kabbalah. So maybe this just includes kabbalah, and zrika we learn from the other pasuk, and that's another way of reading it. Okay. Eshkachan el nazir, shar shlamim minalan. Okay, well that got us the el nazir. What about all other shlamim? Maybe it's only true for the el nazir. Now, why would you think that? Well, again, we're back to the v'chitema. V'chitema ne'elef me'el nazir. Maybe you could just learn it from there to all of them. Mala el nazir shekin yeshemayim damim achirim. But there, it has a bunch of bloods because there's other animals he brings with it. It's a part of a trio of 3 korbanot. Okay. Well, im kein nichtov shlamav. It should be shlamav, not shalmei. It should have said shlamav. This is his shlamim. Okay? If it wanted to say just the nazir. My shlamim, it just says in general, peace offerings. So why does it say it in general? The rabot kol shlamim. So that's how we get to all shlamim. Okay, what are we left with? Eshkachan shlamim, shar kol kodshim minalim. Well, that only teaches us about b'yishinu ba'alim by shlamim. How do we get all other korbanot? V'chitem anelef mishlamim. If you want to say learn from shlamim, ma'al shlamim. Well, shlamim has its own chumrah because there's certain things you do about a shlamim that don't exist, all these things together, in any other korban. Some parts do, but not all 3. What are they? Shlamim needs shkentunim smicha. You have to do smicha on the korban. You have to lean your body on your weight on the korban. Nisachim, there's wine libations that go with it, and snufat chazevashuk, and you wave the chest and the thigh of the animal. There's this waving procedure you do. That only exists by shlamim, so maybe you can't learn from there to everything else. Ela amarkra, how do we get from there to everything? Zot haTorah la'olah u'lemincha u'lechatad u'la'asham u'lemiluim u'lezevach hashlamim. What do you see here? A pasuk at the end of the section of korbanot that basically compares all of them to each other. So, ekishana katuv l'shlamim, ma shlamim bein shinoi kodesh bein shinoi ba'alim be'inan l'shma, av kol bein shinoi kodesh bein shinoi ba'alim be'inan l'shma. Just like it's true for shlamim, because all the cases of lishma were learned from a korban shlamim. From there we learn to all the others. Okay? Now, last question for today. Well, if these psukim all tell you that it has to be lishma, then why is it not disqualified? Remember what we learned? It's kasher. It's just, it doesn't work for the owner, right? The owner has to bring a new korban, but it is kasher. Why don't we say then it's disqualified? If we just showed that this is a problem, why don't we say it's completely disqualified? To which we answer, there's a special pasuk that references the fact that it's not disqualified. What is that? Amar kra, motzas vatechet tishmor basita kasher nadarta. Right? We learned this already. What's the problem with this pasuk? Hi nidav. Right? This is on daf bet. Hi nidava nederhu. Right? do what you promised you said, right? Vasita kasher nadarta, and do like you vowed. And then it says nidava, it's a voluntary offering. But now wait, neder and nidava are two different things. We proved that today. One is harei alai, one is harei zo. So, ela kemosha nadarta asita, yehe neder, v'im lav, yehe nidava. This basically references this halacha. If you do the way you promised, then it's a neder. If not, you still bring it as a nidava though. You bring it as some other offering. And that proves exactly this point. Okay, and then we're going to have to say why we need this pasuk and why we need the other pasuk. In other words, okay, theoretically, this pasuk should have taught us everything we learned today about Shinur Kodesh. So why do we also need the pasuk that basically compared the shlamim to everything else? And that we're going to get to tomorrow. So what we did today, and I'll quickly share the study guide to go through very briefly. We basically started with the 4 Shchita, Kabbalah, Zrikan, Olacha to prove how we know Shinur Kodesh. We had a pasuk for each, and we proved why we couldn't learn one from the other. From then, we moved to Shinur Baalim, and we did Shchita first. Then we tried to learn from there to all the rest as a group. We couldn't do that. We learned then to Zrika. In the end, we learned Kabbalah and Holacha really from a way that we really did group them all together, although theoretically maybe it excluded Zrika, as we said, and that was one possibility. But theoretically, maybe you don't even need the pasuk by Zrika, because depending on how, right, these possibilities that came up earlier, they came up later, maybe you could learn them all from Shchita. And then that was all by the Nazir. How do we know all the Shlamim? That was from the word Shlamim, not Shlamav. And how do we know for all of the Korbanot? And that was from the Hekesh and that pasuk of Zot HaTorah Le'olam L'mincha, etc. And then we just said, how do we know that it's actually not disqualified? And that's because of this pasuk about the neder and the nidava, that if it's not done properly, it turns into a nidava. That's it for today's daf. Wishing everyone a good day and b'sorot tovot.